Deliverables embody the need-satisfying outputs of a project. Deliverables include the visible outputs of the project. They can be tangible, such as a project or a physical structure, or intangible, such as services, instructions, analyses, reports, drawings, specifications, designs, proposals, contract documents, or plans. As such, the significance of deliverables is high because of the role they play in determining if the project is ultimately a success or a failure. A frequent place for deliverables to appear is at the end of project milestones. For a project to continue, it is usually necessary that deliverables are completed at an acceptable level. Deliverables can be as variable as customer requirements. In the broadest sense, deliverables are any output of a project, expected or not. These deliverables include lessons learned, work experience, new business relationships, and miscellaneous incidental information regarding processes, products, customers, and technology that could be helpful for future projects. To be successful in making sure deliverables are acceptable, communicate clearly and often. I recommend that you have the customer define what they want in writing. Although many people resist complying with this request, it goes a long way towards clarifying requirements. Let's look at the other side of the deliverable coin, stakeholders. Stakeholders are those who enable your project to exist. If you define and meet their wants and needs, then your project will be a success. But defining and meeting wants and needs is easier said than done. Think about some things that you purchased online. I recently bought a project management book online, only to be surprised to find that it fit in my shirt pocket. You may not always be able to reach stakeholders. For example, the government often moves forward on projects with only partial information. Citizens may not be able to find out enough about a topic to give an opinion regarding their preferences. Stakeholders are those that have an impact on a project or are affected by a project. This opens up the scope. Because stakeholders have such a critical effect on a project's success, it's essential that you identify them as early as possible during the definition stage of your project. For example, an individual who is manager of the information services department may not have anything to do with a certain project, with the exception that some of the current duties performed by his or her department will no longer be needed. Another example pertains to residents living in a neighborhood adjacent to a construction project. Residents may not be involved in the project except that the noise generated by the project ruins their harmonious existence for the next 6 months. So, the project team needs to have a very broad perspective in identifying stakeholders. Many project managers report after an unsuccessful project attempt that after extensive investigation, they discover that not all stakeholders were identified and informed of the project plan in progress. They end up citing this as a project failure factor. The objective is to make sure there are no surprises for any stakeholder. When you identify and analyze stakeholders, include a section to record their opinions and attitudes about the project. This analysis will help you work appropriately with the various stakeholders. Addressing the issues and concerns of all pertinent stakeholders is not that straightforward and requires diplomacy, tact, patience, and a little bit of charm, which leads to the next point, stakeholder conflict. Referring to a list of typical stakeholders, which include customers, your company, the project team, coworkers, suppliers, and even society, it's not uncommon to find varying expectations. A while ago, I participated in the proposed relocation of a manufacturing facility. One unique aspect of the project pertained to significant storage requirements, about 30,000 square feet for frozen and refrigerated product currently maintained at an off-site contracted warehouse. The move would involve erecting freezers and refrigerators in a new building and bringing this inventory inside the company. Also, there was a requirement to consolidate operations taking place in 4 separate buildings ranging from 15,000 to 20,000 square feet. Lastly, there had to be sufficient expansion space for future growth and potential for acquisition of another company. The project manager was continually challenged by various requests and requirements from stakeholders, including, where will my office be? Are you sure you'll be able to bring all the inventory into the company? And how are you going to move the gigantic pieces of machinery? The resolution to these conflicts is varied and situational. You often need to negotiate. I recommend you follow these guidelines to help you resolve stakeholder conflict. Don't be hesitant about requesting assistance from functional managers should the source of conflict come from a project team member. Utilize excellent communication skills for dealing with all and most certainly external customers. Try to use a win-win approach when possible. Attempt to determine where all stakeholders stand and try to understand where they're coming from. Initiate communication very early on. However, use your best judgment so you don't unnecessarily make stakeholders apprehensive about the results of your project. Don't attempt to please everyone. Some stakeholders may warrant higher priorities than others. You may find that by pleasing a lesser stakeholder, you may offend a more important one. Once again, having a good understanding of all stakeholders will assist you with this activity. Try to identify top management allies that you can turn to for assistance when conflict starts to occur at a higher level of the organizational structure. I earlier mentioned that having stakeholders document project deliverables was advisable. Now let's turn our attention to a process that builds on this concept. I advise that you hold a consolidating meeting when possible that includes all multiple stakeholders so they can review project deliverables in one setting. The resulting interaction will hopefully yield improved plans and identify existing or potential conflicts. Strive to assemble logical configurations of stakeholders. It may prove worthwhile to have one meeting for internal stakeholders and one for external stakeholders, including any regulatory or other government individuals. The whole point of the meeting is to achieve a common understanding through the meeting of minds of the supplier of deliverables and stakeholders. Schedule these meetings as necessary to ensure that the stakeholders understand and are on board with the plans for your project deliverables. Now that you have a good understanding of the different phases of a project and know all about deliverables, you're ready to learn how to scope and schedule a project. The phrase scope a project is another term from the project management world. It refers to making sure that you set the original boundaries for your project. Your success in setting up and implementing a project has a great deal to do with creating an effective plan. When you understand all the variables of your project and define the scope properly, your plan and the results that follow have a much better chance of meeting stakeholder expectations. Let's continue by discussing what is arguably the most valuable item in your project management toolbox, a work breakdown structure, or a WBS. We'll discuss two different versions of WBS. Then we'll look at ways to schedule your project. There are two popular methods you can use. Make sure you completely understand these concepts, as you will need to include them in your project plan. So regarding the work breakdown structure, the WBS, I believe that just about everybody has used one at one time or another. The problem is they probably didn't even know they were using it because they did not recognize the official name. Even though WBS is quite popular and extremely useful, I'm amazed when I learn that so many people try to manage their projects without it. In the purest sense, you can't make a project schedule without a WBS. The reason? You haven't identified any task. Nevertheless, some project managers will move forward full speed ahead and try their best to accomplish their objectives. When you work on a project, you can only work on one item at a time. Even if you're a whiz at multitasking, if your project is to build the next space shuttle, there are thousands of tasks that you must identify. Can you imagine trying to complete such a monumental project without focusing on each individual activity? The first step in the planning phase is to define your objectives as a statement of work, or an SOW. A SOW is an expansion of your objectives and is the starting point for determining the tasks that make up your WBS. Take a few minutes and research a statement of work, an SOW, on the internet to increase your understanding. To use a WBS, break down each initial deliverable into as many small pieces as necessary. Continue this process until your project team is satisfied that all project activities are identified and vertically or hierarchically related to each other correctly. A key word associated with WBS is decomposition. Decomposition means that you take a project deliverable, for example, a bridge or a 75th wedding anniversary party, and divide it into its elemental parts. The underlying premise is to use a WBS that you proceed from the general to the specific. It is a way to subdivide your project in a logical, organized way. First, you create major groups. Next, you split the major groups into tasks. Then, you separate the task into subtasks, and so on. You may be wondering how much detail you should use in a WBS. While there is no official rule, you need to set levels of tasks so that you can control them and manage them without too much effort. An effective WBS provides many benefits for your project. Let's look at them. First, it defines the scope. Since a WBS identifies all your project tasks, it communicates what you are planning to do and what you are excluding. To a large extent, it is your project plan. Second, it integrates activities. The task list of a WBS indicates what everyone needs to do. While most tasks are done by project team members, company departments and outside agencies may also participate. A WBS helps coordinate actions. Next, it assigns responsibilities. Once you develop tasks and subtasks, it's a snap to delegate them. When people know what you expect, they have a better chance to complete tasks on time and with the desired level of quality. Next, determine cost. The primary elements of project cost are labor hours, direct materials, indirect costs such as freight costs, and overhead such as building cost allocation. When you develop costs for each task, it leads to a statement of cost for the entire project. Finally, it facilitates scheduling. While the other benefits are important, I believe that this one is the most essential. After you complete a WBS, it's straightforward to transfer each task to your schedule. Let's continue and examine the different WBS methods. The phrase flow format comes from its similarity to a flowchart. Suppose you are an old school audio enthusiast and decide to make a stereo receiver from a kit to play your favorite recordings and listen to free radio programs. You can use a flow format WBS to define these activities. In this example, the work packages consist of completing pretest of the components needed for the amplifier, the tuner, and the preamplifier. These three subassemblies of the receiver share common components and use the same test equipment. It makes sense for one department to be responsible for the work packages. Because of its simplicity, I highly suggest you use the flow format WBS in your project plan to present a summarized view of your project to management and customers. This format resembles documents you may be familiar with. Standard operating procedures, known as SOPs, use a similar format. Review the following diagram. To make product 1, you need 1 unit of A, B, and C. To make 1 unit of A, you need 1 of B and 1 of D, and so on. When you have a project that has more than 30 tasks, I recommend that you use an indented WBS because the flow format version can get cluttered in a hurry. Now that you know the basics of WBS, let's discuss how to schedule the task. We'll start out with Gantt charts.